Hi friends, it's time for chapter 2 of Winn-Dixie. Let's see if we can remember what happened in chapter 1. Let's see. The little girl was told to go to the grocery store and she was supposed to buy some things. What was she supposed to buy? Oh yes, she had a few things that she needed to buy, but what did she bring home instead? Winn-Dixie. All right, here we go, chapter 2. That summer I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer that me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida. So he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary to India, and that is how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go to the grocery store. But you know what? I told Winn-Dixie, you are a suffering dog, and so maybe he will take you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk. Bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all of my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and to be quiet because this was an adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mr. Detweiler's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him. When he got to the trailer, he sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which means he was thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, do you know how you always tell me you should help those less fortunate than ourselves? He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Oh, is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes it reminded me of a turtle hiding inside of its shell and there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. We don't need a dog. Oh, I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn-Dixie! Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air, and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of the pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. "What did you call this dog?" the preacher asked. "Winn-Dixie," I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. I was making him poke his head out of his shell. "Well," said the preacher, "he's a stray, if I've ever seen one." He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind his ears, and a less fortunate too. "That's for sure. Are you looking for a home?" the preacher asked, real soft, to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. "Well," the preacher said, "I guess you found one." That's the end of chapter 2.